It's LCA 2010, linux.conf.au. It's a conference that is held in lots and lots of Australian cities every year. It's not actually a Linux conf, it's a free and open source software conference. It roves around Australia and New Zealand. This year's was 2 weeks ago. It was in Wellington. Incidentally, next year's is in Brisbane. You should go. But you know, why am I talking about this here? LCA has a tradition of not being an app development conference. It's normally focused on kernel development or end user stuff. This makes me very, very unhappy. We fixed this in 2010 by holding an open programming languages mini-conf for the first time, which was an opportunity for people to give talks on the subject of app development. We had talks on Haskell, PHP, Perl, and 2 on Python, and they were really, really, really good. No, really good. Python was fantastically represented. I'm hoping that we'll be able to do this again next year, and if I do, I want at least some of you to be a part of it. It's probably going to be early February in Brisbane. If we do get accepted, we'll have a CFP sometime around September probably. Follow the Sydney Python mailing list for more information on that. Second talk, how to keep up with stuff that's going on in Python. Who here hasn't heard of planet.python.org before? Good, a lot of you. Planet Python is a series of Python developer blogs where you can get 350 different feeds on Python all in the one place, containing feeds ranging on topics from the core developers, library developers, Python users. There's a really, really high signal to noise ratio, unlike, say, Planet Debian. It helps you keep up to date with Python development, learn new techniques, and answer really, really difficult Python questions like what are the latest developments in improving the speed of Python execution, and when can I expect these to land in my own interpreter? And you'd actually have an answer to that. Subscribe to it now at planet.python.org. I really, really, really recommend it. And finally, an important announcement. There's going to be a PyCon AU this year. Everyone be excited. Yay. Cool. Don't know when it's going to be, although I've heard some whisperings that it's going to be sometime around the middle of this year here in Sydney. We have a mailing list. Go subscribe to it at au.pycon.org. We also have an IRC channel on Freenode, pycon-au. Yeah, go to all these addresses and 2 minutes 56. I did a 3 lightning talks in 3 minutes. Still can't do a 5-minute talk.
It's the wrong one. Thank Apple for swapping out the adapter types each couple of years. So is it coming up? No, not yet. Yep, it's doing something. All right, so this talk is really about my last 4 months. And it's an observation that I've made in kind of the open government space and a lot of sustainability work, a lot of work is being done in Python. And so I'm sure if you're like me, you all love information graphics. You know, we live in a complex world in which, you know, we've got trillion-dollar deficits or $12 trillion debts and massive stimulus packages. And there's really no good way to get your head around these kind of numbers and all the sorts of problems that we have. So enter information graphics. Helps you see things in proportions. Graphic artists are meeting up with statisticians to create these great things. But it can also lead to sorts of controversy and lots of debate. When the debate breaks down on topics like global warming, in which people take a lot of these graphs that are put out by the IPCC and they start dissecting it and looking for places that overlap. And so really, if you start using graphics as your communication method, you really have to have something to back it up. You can't just do it all through great information graphics. You need transparency behind it. And you need to allow people to get to the underlying data. And so what I've kind of been looking at and studying a lot over the 4 months is the trend towards open government. the data.gov in the US, big site in the UK, and lots of these open government hackfests and things here in Sydney. Has anybody been to any of those? The Hackfest, OpenGov things, the government mashups. Has anybody heard of them? Okay, good. So the word is getting out, and it's quite an exciting area. And when I was at the hackathon, actually here in this room, I noticed that there was a surprising number of people using Python, and I wasn't using Python at that point. In fact, I was thinking I wanted to use Clojure or something like that. And but you're just seeing the type of momentum that Python had. It seemed to really be getting traction as being the language of choice for doing the data slicing and dicing, pre-processing this information, generating, and being the real engine behind a lot of these information graphics. And in fact, the Sunlight Foundation in the US, which is involved in a lot of these hackathons, they're doing a hackathon at the next PyCon, I think, in Atlanta. And over half of the projects done are now being done in Python. You know, you see Ruby, the little diagram down on the bottom. Ruby's got just under half, and there's still a lot in PHP. At the hackathon here, Digital Eskimo, courtesy to them, they showed how you can go a step beyond information graphics to do mashups. You can combine images, you can pull in open government data, and you can put it on a web service and allow you to query to see where your stimulus dollars are going per zip code. And so that starts to add some of that transparency. Then you can play around with assumptions, play with the data. And then there's a whole other angle, because open government, open data, that's about data, government putting up data to bring it to you. But you can take it the other direction, and that's using personal information gathering information about your eating habits, your diet, keeping like a GPS print of the different places that you visit, and using that data and using that then to drive insights that then go back to governments. So for example, you've got the cab finder or the cab tracker in San Francisco, and this shows how over the period of a couple years, they were able to track the movements of taxis. And they were able to use this movement to then get insights into how the city works. So for example, during the day, they discovered that the main use of taxi cabs was getting people to and from medical appointments and things. And so these are elderly people who aren't as mobile potentially, I don't know, but it's an interesting line of reasoning to start going down. And so you see that open government really goes two ways. It's government putting data out there for you, and it's also bringing, gathering personal information and taking that back. A couple years ago, I did one of my own experiments, and I looked at comparing social behavior between developers at Atlassian, about 70 people at the time, and how they interacted using RSS feeds and collaboration tools. And I compared it to different subgroups to understand social behavior. And I found, to my great astonishment, and I'm not sure if it's a useful insight, that the social network behavior of these developers, in fact, most closely resembled not the sports team, not the bowling club, not any of these other social groups, but a pod of dolphins. And so there is this kind of alchemy that comes as you begin to mix information graphics, gathering data on mobile devices and using it and pulling that then together with open government data to create a data commons. And there are lots of projects popping up that I'm following now on GitHub and on Bitbucket and others where you're seeing data exploration and ways of digging in and understanding what's going on in the world happen, and you can then, I'm following then a number of these projects. And so 4 months ago, to bring it back to my personal story, I quit my job and I broke out on my own to do a startup in which I'm trying to create a sustainability data commons pulling from these sources. So pulling from personal data feeds that people have, open government data, and bringing together corporate and economic data on things like climate change, and then even corporate data like life cycle assessments from different companies. And Python has been extremely effective at slicing that up. We're getting an app deployed up on App Engine and on Google App Engine and Django, and it seems to just be a great platform for that. And so that's how I'm really hoping that Python is going to help us create a more sustainable and viable future. Thank you.
Okay, I thought it'd be a little bit different. So those of you who don't know, there's a thing out there called Jython. Why would you want to have Python and Java? We'll talk about that later. It was released a long time ago, and nothing happened, and nothing happened, and nothing happened, and then finally in June last year we got 2.5, which all of a sudden gave us new classes and a whole pile of other things. And then 2.51, and then Oracle in their infinite wisdom went and sacked the lead developer. We'll worry about that later. It needs Java 1.5 or later. Okay, so you use it just like normal Python. So here, use virtual environment, works with it. We install a virtual environment for Jython. We go and load setup tools. We then activate the thing. We use easy install and download Django. This is all happening in Jython, it's not happening in Python. We get all the dependencies. Then there's this wonderful little package called Django Jython, which basically has been written to replace the database drivers and to patch various little bits and pieces that don't work in the Django trunk. Most of it does though. Then we do a little bit of configuration, and you'll notice the biggest change is, if anybody knows Django, is in the database engine there's a really long Java class name rather than the short names like Postgres and things like that. What is supported is Postgres, MySQL, Oracle, they work well. SQLite actually doesn't work very well at all. It's the last one that was done. They're looking for bug fixes. It falls over when you're doing the initial setup of Django, but you can actually hand load some tables and things work. We then do the run server, but just throw Jython in front of it and it works. We then do some coding and testing. And all this is done using the Django local service, so code reloading works, all the things that you're used to in Django, or the other way you can do it, you can be doing your Django and CPython, and all that works, and then you can copy across a normal CPython developed Django app, and as long as you haven't used C extensions and things like that, it will hopefully work. But the more important thing is they've actually added into the manage.py where you install Django Jython is the ability to deploy it so it runs in Tomcat or some J2EE server. So only a couple of changes you have to do. You have to add DOJ as an installed app. You run the war command on the manage.py and it goes away and packages everything up. There's additional things to include Java libraries that it won't be able to identify. So one of them, of course, is the JODBC driver for whatever database you're using. You can add to that list. You can tell it that you want a light install, so you don't want Jython package with it. So if you want to have a cross thing, and that'll create a little WAR file, and you can then happily drop that in Tomcat. And that's the one thing where Java's got it over all of us, is deploying a web app makes life so much nicer. Okay, so I'm going to ask some of my own questions. Why would we even bother with this? Sadly out there's these people called enterprise sysadmins. And you mention installing a C package on their pristine box. They look at you and then they threaten to hit you. So by doing this, you can give them the warm fuzzies. And that's the reason I have to look at it, because it hasn't happened yet, but I know one day it will. That somebody's going to turn around to me and say I'm not allowed to install CPython. The next question is performance. Running locally, I wouldn't have been able to give you this talk in 5 minutes. Okay, it does take a little bit longer because of the way classes have to be loaded and interpreted. When you build the WAR file, all the compiled classes are loaded up. So when it's running inside Tomcat, it actually runs quite well. Probably not as fast as CPython, but as we all know, any web app that's got database I/O, that's where the bottleneck is, not in interpreting the Java code. Resources, about 3 times as much memory as CPython to run, but again, these sysadmins don't suffer any fear for the fact that you're using lots of their RAM, because they've got lots of it for you to share. So that's basically mine, and I did it with 15 seconds to spare.